The cotton mill's whistle pierced the thick November air of Manchester, New Hampshire, signalling the end of another grueling 14-hour shift. Thomas Murphy wiped the sweat and cotton dust from his weathered face as he made his way through the maze of spinning machines that had been his world for the past 3 years. At 25, his hands were already scarred from countless cuts and burns, the price of working in Samuel Whitmore's textile empire. The year was 1852, and the Industrial Revolution had transformed New England into a landscape of brick factories and smoking chimneys. Thomas had come from Ireland during the Great Famine, carrying nothing but hope and determination to build a better life in America. The mill work was dangerous and poorly paid, but it was steady employment in a world where such security was precious. As Thomas stepped into the crisp evening air, he noticed something unusual. Black smoke was billowing from the upper windows of the Whitmore mansion that sat majestically on the hill overlooking the mill complex. Unlike the usual grey smoke from the factory chimneys, this smoke was thick and acrid, carrying the unmistakable smell of burning fabric and wood. The Whitmore estate was legendary in their small industrial town. Samuel Whitmore had built his fortune from a single textile mill into a vast empire spanning 3 states. His daughters, Margaret and Elizabeth, were known throughout New England society as both beautiful and charitable, though Thomas had only glimpsed them during their rare visits to inspect the family business. Without hesitation, Thomas dropped his dinner pail and ran toward the mansion. His legs, tired from standing at the loom all day, found renewed strength as he climbed the steep hill. Other workers noticed the smoke and followed, but Thomas was the fastest runner among them. The mansion's front door stood open, and terrified servants were streaming out carrying valuable paintings and silverware. Thomas pushed through the crowd and grabbed the arm of Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper whom he recognized from her occasional visits to the mill. "Where are the Miss Whitmores?" Thomas shouted over the chaos. "Still inside." "Third floor," Mrs. Henderson cried, her face streaked with soot.
"The main staircase collapsed."
"We cannot reach them." Thomas looked up at the mansion's imposing facade. The third-floor windows glowed orange with firelight, and he could see 2 figures silhouetted against the flames. Without thinking, he ran around to the back of the house, where he remembered seeing a servant's staircase during his few visits to deliver mill reports. The narrow wooden stairs creaked ominously under his weight, and smoke filled his lungs as he climbed higher. The heat grew more intense with each step. On the 2nd floor, he could hear the crackling of flames and the groaning of stressed timber. The main staircase had indeed collapsed, leaving a gaping hole filled with burning debris. Thomas pressed a wet handkerchief over his nose and mouth, a trick he had learned from factory fires at the mill. He continued up the servants' stairs, praying they would hold his weight long enough to reach the 3rd floor. The door to the 3rd floor was hot to the touch, but not yet burning. Thomas pushed it open and was met with a wall of smoke and heat. Through the haze, he could see 2 women in elegant silk dresses huddled near a window. Margaret Whitmore, the elder daughter at 23, was tall and stately, with chestnut hair piled high in the fashion of the day. Elizabeth, 21, was shorter but equally striking, with golden curls and piercing blue eyes that now reflected pure terror. "Miss Whitmore's," Thomas called out.
"This way!"
"The servants' stair is still passable." Margaret looked at him with a mixture of recognition and disbelief. "Thomas Murphy, from the mill?" "Yes, miss. We must go now, before the floor gives way." Elizabeth was coughing violently from the smoke. Margaret supported her sister, while Thomas cleared a path through the burning debris. The floorboards beneath their feet were beginning to sag and crack from the intense heat below. Thomas took Elizabeth's other arm, and together they made their way toward the servants' staircase. The young woman was surprisingly heavy, weakened by the smoke and shock. Her elaborate dress, with its layers of petticoats and crinolines, made movement difficult in the narrow stairwell. "Leave me," Elizabeth gasped. "Save Margaret first." "We all go together or not at all," Thomas replied firmly, remembering similar words his father had spoken during the darkest days of the famine in Ireland. The descent was treacherous. The stairs groaned and swayed with their combined weight, and burning embers fell around them like deadly snow. Margaret's dress caught fire at the hem, and Thomas quickly beat out the flames with his bare hands, adding new burns to his collection of scars. By the time they reached the ground floor, the servants' staircase was beginning to collapse behind them. Thomas pushed both women toward the back door just as a section of the ceiling crashed down where they had been standing moments before. Outside, a crowd had gathered to watch the mansion burn. The volunteer fire brigade had arrived with their hand-pumped engine, but their efforts seemed futile against the massive blaze that now consumed the upper floors of the grand house. Margaret and Elizabeth collapsed on the grass, coughing and gasping for clean air. Their elegant dresses were torn and blackened with soot, their carefully arranged hair dishevelled and singed. But they were alive. "You saved our lives," Margaret whispered to Thomas, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "We can never repay such a debt." Thomas knelt beside them, checking for injuries. "No debt between neighbours, miss. Anyone would have done the same." But even as he spoke those humble words, Thomas knew that his life had changed forever. He had entered that burning mansion as an anonymous factory worker. He emerged as the man who had saved Samuel Whitmore's most precious treasures, his daughters. As the flames continued to consume the mansion's upper floors, none of them could have imagined the shocking decision that Samuel Whitmore would make when he returned from his business trip to Boston the following day. The mill owner's reaction to his daughter's rescue would set in motion events that would challenge every assumption about class, worth, and destiny in their rigidly stratified society. The industrial age was reshaping America, but some changes would prove more dramatic than others. The morning sun cast long shadows across the smouldering ruins of the Whitmore mansion as Samuel Whitmore's black carriage thundered up the cobblestone drive. His team of 4 horses, bred from the finest stock in Kentucky, snorted and stamped as the coachman pulled them to an abrupt halt before what had once been the grandest home in Manchester. Samuel Whitmore stepped down from his carriage with the measured grace of a man accustomed to commanding empires. At 55, he possessed the kind of presence that made other men step aside and tip their hats respectfully. His silver hair was perfectly groomed beneath his black top hat, and his expensive wool coat bore no wrinkles despite the long journey from Boston. But as his steely grey eyes took in the devastated remains of his family home, his composed facade cracked for just a moment. The mansion's facade still stood, but the upper floors were a blackened skeleton of charred timber and collapsed stone. Servants moved about the grounds like ghosts, salvaging what little remained of the family's possessions. The acrid smell of burned wood and fabric still hung heavy in the November air. "Father!" Margaret's voice called out from the guest cottage where she and Elizabeth had spent the night. Both sisters rushed across the lawn, their day dresses simple and borrowed from the servants' quarters, a stark contrast to their usual elaborate wardrobes that had been consumed in the flames. Samuel opened his arms to embrace his daughters, his hands trembling slightly as he held them close. "My dear girls, when I received the telegram at the Parker House Hotel, I feared the worst. Thank God you are safe." "We nearly weren't, Father," Elizabeth said, her voice still hoarse from smoke inhalation. "If not for Thomas Murphy from your mill, we would have perished in the flames." Samuel's eyebrows rose sharply. "Thomas Murphy? The Irishman who works the 3rd shift on the spinning floor?" "The very same," Margaret confirmed. "He climbed through that inferno and carried us both to safety. The main staircase had collapsed, and we were trapped on the 3rd floor. Father, he risked his life for us without a moment's hesitation." Samuel released his daughters and walked slowly toward the mansion ruins, his mind working with the calculated precision that had built his textile empire. He had not achieved his success through sentiment alone, but through careful observation of character and strategic decision-making. The fact that a lowly mill worker had displayed such courage and selflessness was information that demanded careful consideration. Mrs. Henderson approached with a concerned expression. "Mr. Whitmore, sir, the fire started in the library chimney. The flue must have been damaged during last month's storm. I'm afraid we lost most of the upper floors, including your study and all the business documents stored there. Papers can be replaced." "Mrs. Henderson, my daughters cannot." Samuel's voice was firm but thoughtful. "Tell me more about this Thomas Murphy. How did he know to enter through the servants' quarters?" "He's been to the house before, sir," the housekeeper explained. "Young Murphy has delivered mill reports several times when the regular messenger was ill. Always polite and respectful. Never lingered where he wasn't supposed to be." Samuel nodded slowly. He remembered the young Irishman, now serious, hard-working, never complained despite the dangerous conditions in the mill. Murphy had arrived during the worst of the Irish potato famine, part of the wave of immigrants who had provided cheap labour for New England's expanding industries. But unlike many of his countrymen who had fallen into drink or despair, Murphy had proven reliable and steady. "Where is Mr. Murphy now?" Samuel asked. "At the mill, sir," Margaret replied. "He reported for his regular shift this morning as if nothing had happened. Some of the other workers said he wouldn't even accept their offers to buy him drinks in celebration of his heroism. This information intrigued Samuel even more. A man who saved his daughters' lives and then simply returned to work without seeking reward or recognition possessed a character trait that Samuel valued above all others: integrity. "Father, we must do something to thank him properly," Elizabeth insisted. "A small monetary gift seems inadequate for saving our lives." Samuel was quiet for several minutes, studying the ruins of his mansion, while his mind formulated a plan that was as bold as it was unprecedented. In the rigid social hierarchy of 1850s New England, there were unspoken rules about the interaction between mill owners and their workers. These boundaries had served Samuel well in business, but they had never been tested by circumstances as extraordinary as these. "Summon Mr. Murphy to meet me at the mill office at 2 o'clock this afternoon," Samuel finally announced, "and prepare our finest guest room at the Elm Street boarding house. Mr. Murphy will no longer be sleeping in the workers' tenement." Margaret and Elizabeth exchanged surprised glances. Their father's boarding house was reserved for mill supervisors and visiting business associates, not common labourers. "Father, what are you planning?" Margaret asked. Samuel straightened his shoulders and adjusted his gold pocket watch, a gesture his daughters recognized as a sign that he had reached a momentous decision. "I am planning to demonstrate that in America, a man's worth is not determined solely by the circumstances of his birth, but by the content of his character." As Samuel walked toward his carriage to ride down to the mill complex, his mind was already working through the implications of what he was about to propose. The decision forming in his thoughts would shock Manchester's tight-knit industrial community and challenge every social convention they held sacred. Thomas Murphy had entered a burning building as a nameless factory worker, but Samuel Whitmore was about to ensure that he emerged from this meeting as something entirely different. The Tycoon's shocking decision would not only change Thomas's life forever, but it would also set in motion events that would test the very foundations of their stratified society. The Industrial Revolution had created new fortunes and new social structures, but it had also created new possibilities for men of courage and character to rise above their station. Samuel Whitmore was about to prove that in America, even the most rigid social boundaries could be crossed by those brave enough to save lives and humble enough to return to work the next day. As his carriage rolled down the hill toward the textile mill, Samuel smiled for the first time since receiving news of the fire. He had built his empire by recognizing opportunity where others saw only obstacles. Today, he would demonstrate that the greatest opportunities often came disguised as simple acts of human decency. Thomas Murphy stood outside the mill office precisely at 2 o'clock, cap in hand, boots newly polished with a rag and lamp oil. The red brick building loomed beside the Merrimack River, its windows rattling with the thrum of 1,000 spindles. Word of the summons had spread through the factory like sparks on dry cotton, and scores of workers found excuses to linger near open loading doors, hoping to witness whatever fate awaited the Irishman who had saved the heiress sisters. Inside, Samuel Whitmore's private office smelled of mahogany, ink, and ever-present cotton dust. Thick ledgers lay open on a broad desk, but the mill owner's attention was fixed on the man before him. Thomas removed his cap, eyes lowered in respect, yet his back remained straight, the posture of one who expected nothing but feared little. "Mr. Murphy," Whitmore began, voice calm, "my daughters have spoken at length about your bravery. They owe their lives to you. I owe my world." He paused, letting the thought settle. "Last night, I realized that gratitude expressed in coins or polite letters would insult the value of what you did. I intend something different," Thomas swallowed. "Sir, saving Miss Margaret and Miss Elizabeth was right and natural. Any decent man would have tried." "Perhaps," Whitmore replied, "but not every man would have succeeded. Tell me, how long have you worked my looms?" 3 years, sir, since arriving from County Cork. And before that, farm labour back home. Bit of carpentry when work allowed." Whitmore nodded, as though ticking items on an invisible list. "Good, the mill expands next spring. I will need a new floor manager, someone trusted by the men yet willing to enforce standards. The position pays $40 a month, provides residence at the Elm Street house, and includes evening lessons in bookkeeping from my clerk. I offer it to you, effective immediately." Thomas blinked. $40 was double his current wage, and more than some supervisors earned. "Sir, I read little and write less. Surely another man..." Reading can be taught, Whitmore interrupted. Courage cannot. Will you accept? Thomas's first instinct was to refuse. Factory hierarchies were rigid, and Irish labourers rarely leapt so high. Yet behind Whitmore stood Margaret and Elizabeth, summoned as witnesses to their father's promise. Margaret wore a plain grey shawl borrowed from a maid, her once elegant hands still bearing faint burn marks. Elizabeth's eyes, red-rimmed from lingering smoke irritation, shone with hope. "Take it, Mr. Murphy," Elizabeth urged softly. "You earned more than money yesterday. You earned our respect." The murmurs of mill clerks just outside the door reminded Thomas that resentment would surely follow. Still, he thought of the crowded tenement, of sending larger remittances to his widowed mother in Cork, and of nights spent learning figures by lamplight instead of coughing in a damp boarding room. He met Whitmore's steady gaze. "I accept, sir." The Tycoon extended a hand. Thomas shook it, rough fingers against manicured ones, sealing the unprecedented accord. Whitmore rang a bell. Mr. Aldrich, the current floor manager, entered, expression pinched. "Yes, sir." "You will train Mr. Murphy in administrative tasks," Whitmore ordered. "Effective tomorrow, he shares your duties until the new wing opens." Aldrich's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "As you wish." Whitmore dismissed him, then addressed his daughters. "Margaret, prepare a letter to Mr. Turner at the Mechanics Institute in Boston. Enroll Mr. Murphy in their evening courses through correspondence. We will pay the tuition." Thomas's cheeks flushed crimson. He stammered, "Sir, that is too generous." "Nonsense," Whitmore replied. "America thrives when ability rises. You displayed ability." Margaret smiled, her earlier composure tempered by genuine relief. Elizabeth took Thomas's calloused hand briefly. "We are glad Father sees what we saw in the flames, a man worth believing in." Word of the meeting spread faster than the river current. By the supper whistle, opinions divided the workforce. Some cheered that an Irish hand had broken the invisible ceiling. Others muttered that favouritism threatened order. In the Cotton Exchange Tavern that night, mugs slammed and voices rose. "Next, he'll marry a Whitmore and buy us all," sneered one spinner. "Better an Irish hero than a drunk Yankee overseer," another retorted. Thomas avoided the tavern. Instead, he walked to the hillside where the charred mansion stood. Moonlight glinted off blackened beams like bone. Fire crews had left, and the grounds lay silent except for crickets and distant machinery. He knelt where the servants' stairs once met the grass, the spot where he and the sisters escaped. The memory of heat and fear returned with startling clarity. For the first time since the rescue, his knees trembled. Courage came in the moment, he realized. Reflection brought doubt. Footsteps crunched behind him. Samuel Whitmore approached, carrying 2 steaming tin cups. "Couldn't sleep either, Mr. Murphy?" he asked, handing Thomas 1 cup. It was tea, strong and unsweetened. "Too many thoughts, sir." Whitmore stared at the ruins. "I built that house to prove I'd arrived. Now I see it was never truly mine. Brick and wood can vanish overnight. Only character endures." He turned to Thomas. "Men will question today's decision. Stand firm. Learn quickly. Lead fairly. If you stumble, admit it and rise. Do that, and resentment will fade." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of newfound responsibility settle on his shoulders like the wool coat he had never owned. They drank in silence, 2 men from different worlds united by a single night's fire. The following morning, Thomas moved into the Elm Street boarding house. The room surprised him. A tidy space with a small writing desk, an oil lamp, and a view of the river where pale dawn light danced on water. He unpacked his 1 spare shirt and a pocket Bible, placing both carefully in the bureau. For the first time since leaving Ireland, he felt he might truly belong somewhere. At 6, he walked the factory floor not as a common operative, but as assistant manager. Machine noise thundered, yet he heard every whisper that trailed behind his passage. Aldrich introduced him to clerks, tally rooms, and the system of coloured tags indicating production quotas. Thomas listened, asked questions, and kept notes on a scrap pad the clerk supplied. By midday, even the gruff loom fixers admitted the new boss made no pretense, inspecting spindles alongside them and wiping grease on his own sleeve. Lunch found him in the canteen, not the manager's dining room, sharing bread and salt pork with former workmates. Some sat awkwardly. Thomas laughed easily, spoke little of his promotion, and more about ways to reduce loom jams. Gradually, tension eased. Respect he knew must be earned twice, once in fire, once in daylight labour. That evening, a horse-drawn post coach brought materials from the Mechanics Institute, arithmetic primers, Engineering pamphlets, a slate, and chalk wrapped in brown paper. Thomas traced the chalk between his fingers, aware that each equation he mastered would strengthen the bridge Samuel Whitmore had dared to build across class lines. Yet outside the lamplight, resistance gathered. Mr. Aldrich whispered to certain investors that Whitmore's sentimentality threatened profit margins. Rival mill owners in Lowell scoffed at rumours of an Irish upstart commanding Yankees. And in Boston, a newly formed board of factory inspectors, alarmed by last week's deadly fire, prepared to scrutinise every Whitmore facility. Thomas's promotion was only the first ripple. Bigger waves would follow, but for now, he sat at his new desk, opened the arithmetic primer, and slowly copied the first problem. If a spindle turns 3,000 revolutions per minute, how many in 1 hour? He smiled, reckoning both numbers and the strange trajectory of his own life. 3 weeks into Thomas Murphy's new position, the first real challenge arrived on a grey December morning in the form of Mr. Cornelius Hartwell, president of the New England Mill Owners Association. His polished carriage pulled up to the Whitmore Mill office just as the morning whistle sounded, and workers streaming through the gates cast curious glances at the distinguished visitor in his beaver fur coat and gold-headed walking stick. Samuel Whitmore received Hartwell in his private office, gesturing toward a leather chair beside the fireplace. The two men had known each other for 15 years, their mills competing for the same Boston and New York contracts, yet maintaining the cordial rivalry expected among gentlemen of industry. "Samuel, I come as a friend," Hartwell began, declining the offered brandy despite the morning chill. "Word has reached Boston about your recent personnel decisions. The promotion of this Irish fellow has raised eyebrows among our associates." Whitmore settled into his own chair, hands steepled. Thomas Murphy has proven himself capable. His background is irrelevant to his performance. "His background is everything," Hartwell replied firmly. "We have established systems, Samuel, order. The labourers respect boundaries because they understand their place. When you elevate one so dramatically, you give the others dangerous ideas." Through the office windows, both men could see Thomas on the factory floor, consulting with a machine operator about a tangled thread. His movements were confident but not arrogant, and several workers nodded respectfully as he passed. Yet Hartwell's expression remained disapproving. "He shows promise," Whitmore observed. "Production on his floor has increased 8% since his promotion." "Temporary enthusiasm," Hartwell dismissed. "Mark my words, within 6 months you will face strikes, demands for higher wages, threats to your authority. The Irish are natural agitators, Samuel. They gather in groups and whisper of revolution." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "Thomas Murphy is not political. He focuses on his work, perhaps. But what of the others? I have reliable information that certain labour organisers from Boston plan to visit Manchester next month. They specifically target mills where traditional hierarchies have been disrupted." This news gave Whitmore pause. Labour unrest had plagued several Massachusetts mills the previous summer, resulting in damaged machinery and lost contracts. The textile industry depended on order and predictability. Investors grew nervous when workers began making demands. "What do you propose?" Whitmore asked cautiously. Hartwell leaned forward. "Reassign Murphy to a less visible position. Make him a shift supervisor perhaps, but remove him from floor management. Send a clear message that while you appreciate his heroism, business remains business. And betray my word to a man who saved my daughters' lives? Honor your daughters by protecting the business that provides their future security." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Margaret Whitmore entered, carrying a tea service and wearing a simple blue dress that emphasized her natural elegance despite its plain fabric. She nodded politely to Hartwell before addressing her father. "I apologize for the interruption, but I thought you might appreciate refreshment." Her eyes flickered meaningfully toward the window where Thomas could still be seen working. "Mr. Murphy has implemented several improvements to worker safety this week. The seamstresses particularly appreciate the better lighting he arranged." Hartwell's smile was strained. "How thoughtful of him, Miss Whitmore." After Margaret departed, Hartwell's tone grew more serious. "Your daughter is lovely, Samuel, but her admiration for this fellow concerns me. There are rumours in town." "What sort of rumours?" "That your family's gratitude extends beyond proper boundaries. People notice when young ladies speak favourably of mill workers. In our circles, such talk can damage reputations permanently." Whitmore rose abruptly, his face flushing with anger. "My daughters conduct themselves with perfect propriety. I will not hear suggestions otherwise." I intend no offence, Hartwell replied smoothly. I merely observe that intense gratitude can be misinterpreted. For everyone's sake, perhaps the Murphy situation should be resolved quietly. After Hartwell departed, Whitmore found himself troubled by the conversation. He walked to his office window and watched Thomas demonstrating proper spindle alignment to a new worker. The young Irishman's patience and expertise were evident, yet so was the growing tension Hartwell had described. That afternoon, Mr. Aldrich requested a private meeting. The longtime floor manager entered with obvious reluctance, his normally confident demeanour replaced by nervous fidgeting. Sir, I feel obligated to report certain developments among the workers, Aldrich began. Proceed. Murphy commands respect, I grant you, but his presence has created divisions. The Irish workers expect preferential treatment now. They approach him with grievances they would never bring to me. Meanwhile, the Yankee workers whisper that foreigners are displacing them in management. Whitmore nodded grimly. Specific incidents. Yesterday, Patrick O'Brien complained about dock assignments for unloading cotton bales. Normally, such matters follow established rotation, but he demanded Murphy's intervention. When I explained proper procedures, O'Brien muttered something about new rules for new times. And the Yankees. Bill Thornton, who has worked here 8 years, applied for the assistant bookkeeper position. When I explained that Murphy would handle those duties temporarily, Thornton suggested that long service should count for something. His words were respectful, but his meaning was clear. That evening, Thomas knocked on Whitmore's office door, carrying his weekly production reports. The numbers were impressive. Efficiency up, accidents down, worker complaints reduced to their lowest level in months. Yet Whitmore studied the figures with a frown. Thomas, sit down. We need to discuss your position here. Thomas took the offered chair, sensing trouble in the mill owner's tone. Have I disappointed you, sir? Quite the opposite. Your work exceeds all expectations. Whitmore paused, choosing his words carefully. However, your success has created unexpected complications. Complications, sir? Other mill owners question my judgment. Some workers feel threatened by changes in established order. There are concerns about labour agitators targeting our facility. Thomas absorbed this information quietly. He had noticed the whispered conversations that stopped when he approached, the way certain workers avoided his gaze. Yet he had also seen genuine improvements in working conditions and morale. Do you wish me to resign the position? Thomas asked directly. No, Whitmore replied firmly. But I want you to understand the challenges ahead. Success will require not just competence but wisdom. You must prove that merit-based advancement strengthens rather than threatens our system. I understand, sir. Do you? Because the real test is just beginning. Within days, labour organisers from Boston will arrive in Manchester. They will seek you out, Thomas. They will try to use your promotion as evidence that workers can demand more. How you respond will determine not just your own future, but the stability of this entire operation. Thomas met Whitmore's steady gaze. I will not betray your trust, sir. The work speaks for itself. See that it continues to do so. As Thomas departed, Whitmore remained at his desk long into the evening, reviewing ledgers and correspondence. Outside, the December wind rattled windows and sent snow swirling around the mill buildings. Change was coming whether he welcomed it or not. The question was whether Thomas Murphy would prove strong enough to weather the storm that lay ahead. The Industrial Revolution had created opportunities for men to rise, but it had also created powerful forces determined to maintain existing order. Thomas had climbed higher than any Irish immigrant in Manchester's history, but the hardest part of his journey was just beginning. The labour organisers arrived on a bitter January morning aboard the Boston and Maine Railroad, their breath forming white clouds as they stepped onto the Manchester platform. Patrick Donnelly, a stocky man with calloused hands and piercing blue eyes, led the group of 3. He had organised successful strikes in Lowell and Fall River, and his reputation preceded him like smoke from a factory chimney. Thomas first learned of their presence when young Jimmy O'Malley, barely 16 and new to the mill, approached him during the lunch break with obvious excitement. Mr. Murphy, sir. There's men from Boston asking about you at Mrs. Kelly's boarding house, Jimmy whispered. They say you're proof that workers can rise up and demand better treatment. Thomas set down his tin cup of coffee, his stomach tightening. What exactly did they say, Jimmy? That your promotion shows Mr. Whitmore can be pressured into fairness. They want to meet with you tonight after the shift ends. Throughout the afternoon, Thomas felt the weight of curious stares from fellow workers. Word had spread quickly through the mill floor, and conversations stopped abruptly whenever he passed. By closing time, he had made his decision. The meeting took place in the back room of Murphy's Tavern, an establishment owned by no relation to Thomas, despite the shared surname. The dim space reeked of tobacco smoke and spilled ale, and roughly 20 workers had gathered around mismatched tables. Thomas recognized most faces from the mill floor, including several Irish immigrants who had arrived during the past year. Patrick Donnelly stood as Thomas entered, extending a firm handshake. "The famous Thomas Murphy, I've heard remarkable things about your rise from spinner to manager." "I was promoted based on circumstances beyond my control," Thomas replied carefully. "Mr. Whitmore rewards competence and reliability." "Exactly my point," Donnelly smiled. Whitmore responded to pressure. When his daughters' lives were at stake, he suddenly discovered that an Irish worker possessed value. Imagine what he might discover if all his workers stood together. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. Donnelly continued, his voice gaining strength. "Gentlemen, you witness proof that mill owners can change their practices when properly motivated. Thomas Murphy's promotion demonstrates that artificial barriers between management and labour can be broken." Thomas raised his hand for attention. "Mr. Donnelly, I appreciate your perspective, but my situation was unique. I was rewarded for a specific action, not for making demands." "But why should heroism be required for advancement?" asked Sean O'Brien, a loom operator who had worked beside Thomas for 2 years. "Why shouldn't experience and skill be enough?" "They should be enough," Donnelly agreed eagerly. "And they will be, when workers organize to demand fair treatment. Thomas, your success opens doors for others, but only if we act collectively." The organizer spread papers across the table, revealing detailed lists of grievances from other mills: 14-hour workdays, unsafe machinery, wages that barely covered rent and food, no compensation for injuries sustained during work. Thomas had lived with these conditions for 3 years, accepting them as unchangeable facts of industrial life. "We propose forming a Manchester Mill Workers' Association," Donnelly explained, "not to strike immediately, but to negotiate reasonable improvements. Shorter hours, safety equipment, injury compensation. Thomas, as the highest-ranking Irish worker in the city, your support would legitimize our efforts." Thomas studied the faces around him. These were good men, hard-working fathers and sons who deserved better conditions. Yet he also understood the precarious nature of his own position and the broader implications of labour unrest. "Mr. Donnelly, what you propose sounds reasonable in principle," Thomas began, "but mills operate on narrow profit margins. Demands for major changes could result in layoffs or factory closures. We've all seen what happened in Lawrence when workers struck last year." "Lawrence workers won concessions," Donnelly countered. "Their strike lasted only 2 weeks and resulted in wage increases. After 6 months of reduced production and 3 mill closures," Thomas pointed out, 40 families lost their primary income permanently." The room fell silent as men considered this sobering reminder. Thomas continued, his voice measured and thoughtful. "I suggest a different approach. Rather than organizing to make demands, let us organize to demonstrate value. Propose improvements that increase productivity while enhancing safety. Show Mr. Whitmore and other mill owners that better conditions create better workers, not additional expenses." Donnelly's expression hardened. "You speak like management now, Thomas. Have you forgotten where you came from?" "I remember exactly where I came from," Thomas replied firmly. "I also remember that progress requires wisdom, not just courage. Mr. Whitmore took a considerable risk promoting me. If that decision leads to labour unrest, he will conclude that similar risks are unwise. And you'll lose your comfortable position," sneered Murphy O'Sullivan, a spinner known for his quick temper. Thomas stood, his patience exhausted. "My position is irrelevant. What matters is building a foundation for lasting change rather than temporary gains. You want my support? Earn it by proposing solutions that benefit everyone, not ultimatums that threaten livelihoods." He departed the meeting amid mixed reactions. Some workers nodded approvingly at his moderate stance, while others muttered about betrayal and forgotten loyalties. Donnelly watched Thomas leave with calculating eyes, already formulating alternative strategies. The following morning, Samuel Whitmore summoned Thomas to his office before the work shift began. The mill owner's expression was grave as he gestured toward a chair. "I'm informed that labour organisers met with workers yesterday evening," Whitmore began. "Your presence was noted." Thomas had expected this conversation. "I attended to understand their proposals, sir. I did not commit to their organisation." "What are their intentions?" Formation of a workers' association to negotiate improved conditions. They seek shorter hours, safety equipment, and injury compensation. Whitmore nodded thoughtfully. Reasonable requests in themselves, but timing and methods matter enormously. What position did you take? I suggested that workers demonstrate value rather than make demands, show you that improvements benefit productivity as well as worker welfare. Wise counsel. However, my sources indicate that Mr. Donnelly was displeased with your response. He may pursue more aggressive approaches. This proved prophetic. Within days, unsigned leaflets appeared throughout the mill, posted on walls and distributed during shift changes. The messages were simple but effective. Thomas Murphy abandoned his own kind, and House Irish serve masters, not workers. The campaign created exactly the division Whitmore had feared. Irish workers began avoiding Thomas, viewing him as a traitor to their cause. Yankee workers remained suspicious of his motives, uncertain whether his moderation was genuine or calculated. Only a small group of experienced craftsmen, both Irish and American, continued to support his leadership. Margaret Whitmore noticed the change during her weekly visit to inspect working conditions in the weaving room. She approached Thomas as he supervised the installation of new safety shields around mechanical belts. "The workers seem less friendly toward you lately," she observed quietly. "Politics complicate everything, Miss Whitmore. Some believe I should use my position to advance their agenda. Others believe I should not have been promoted at all. And what do you believe?" Thomas paused his work, considering the question carefully. "I believe that lasting change requires patience and wisdom. Quick victories often create long-term problems." Margaret smiled approvingly. "Father says the same thing about business expansion. Rush too quickly and everything collapses." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the main entrance. Patrick Donnelly had arrived with a group of supporters, demanding to speak with mill management about worker grievances. The confrontation that followed would test Thomas's principles and Samuel Whitmore's commitment to merit-based advancement. The real crisis was about to begin. The confrontation erupted on a frigid February morning when Patrick Donnelly led 30 workers to the mill gates, carrying a formal petition demanding immediate negotiations. Samuel Whitmore stood at his office window, watching the crowd gather while Thomas approached from the factory floor, his face grim with understanding of what this moment represented. "They've forced the issue," Whitmore observed as Thomas entered the office. Donnelly grows impatient with gradual change. Through the glass, they could see workers from other shifts joining the demonstration. Some carried hastily made signs reading "Fair wages now" and "Safety before profit." The crowd remained orderly but determined, their breath forming white clouds in the bitter air. "Sir, I request permission to address them," Thomas said. "Perhaps I can prevent this from escalating." Whitmore studied his young manager's face. "They view you as a traitor now, Thomas. Your words may carry little weight. Then I must try anyway." Outside, Thomas walked directly to the center of the gathering. Conversations died as workers turned to face him, their expressions ranging from hopeful to hostile. Patrick Donnelly stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Thomas Murphy, have you come to join your brothers in demanding justice?" "I've come to prevent good men from making a terrible mistake," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the tension. "Mr. Donnelly, you promised reasonable negotiation, not public demonstrations that threaten everyone's employment." "Reasonable negotiation requires leverage," Donnelly countered. "Mill owners ignore worker concerns until production stops." Thomas turned to address the crowd directly. "Friends, I understand your grievances. I've worked beside most of you, shared your struggles and dangers. But consider what we risk here. This mill employs 400 families. If Mr. Whitmore closes operations or reduces orders because of unrest, who suffers most?" "We suffer now," shouted Murphy O'Sullivan. 14-hour days, dangerous machines, wages that barely feed our children." "Aye, and those conditions need improvement," Thomas agreed. "But destruction serves no one. Let me propose something different." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew several sheets of paper. "I've spent weeks preparing a formal proposal for Mr. Whitmore. Gradual implementation of safety improvements, beginning with the most dangerous equipment. A worker compensation fund for injuries, supported by both management and worker contributions. Rotation of the longest shifts to prevent exhaustion-related accidents." The crowd murmured with interest despite their suspicions. Even Donnelly listened carefully as Thomas continued. "These changes would cost money initially, But they would also reduce accidents, improve productivity, and demonstrate that this mill leads New England in worker welfare. Other mills would follow our example, creating industry-wide improvements. Pretty words, Donnelly interrupted. But where are the guarantees? What happens when Whitmore ignores your proposals? Then you organize your association and pursue stronger measures, Thomas replied. But give negotiation a genuine chance first. You lose nothing by waiting 2 weeks for a response. Samuel Whitmore had been listening from his office doorway. Now he stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention from the gathered workers. I have heard Mr. Murphy's proposal, Whitmore announced, his voice carrying authority built through decades of leadership. More importantly, I have observed his character for 3 months. He has proven that advancement based on merit benefits everyone. I accept his recommendations for immediate implementation. A shocked silence fell over the gathering. Workers exchanged glances, uncertain whether to trust this unexpected concession. Furthermore, Whitmore continued, I propose establishing a permanent workers' council, with Thomas Murphy as chairman and representatives elected from each department. This council will meet monthly with management to address concerns before they become grievances. Patrick Donnelly's face reddened with frustration. His careful plans for confrontation were dissolving into compromise and cooperation. These are empty promises, he declared. Mill owners always agree to discussions when threatened, then forget their commitments once workers return to their looms. Then stay and observe, Thomas challenged. If Mr. Whitmore fails to implement these changes within 30 days, I will personally support whatever actions you deem necessary. The crowd began to disperse, workers discussing this unexpected turn of events in small groups. Some remained skeptical, but others seemed genuinely hopeful about the prospects for peaceful reform. Donnelly departed with his core supporters, muttering about naive idealism and missed opportunities. Over the following month, the promised changes took shape with remarkable speed. Safety guards were installed on the most dangerous machinery. A medical fund was established with contributions from both management and workers. The longest shifts were reduced from 14 to 12 hours, with productivity maintained through improved equipment efficiency. Most significantly, the Workers' Council proved effective at addressing grievances before they escalated. Thomas chaired monthly meetings where representatives could raise concerns about working conditions, and management responded with practical solutions. The system wasn't perfect, but it created communication channels that had never existed before. Margaret Whitmore often attended these meetings as her father's representative, taking detailed notes and offering suggestions based on her observations of factory operations. Her presence initially made workers uncomfortable, but her genuine interest in their welfare gradually earned their respect. The seamstresses appreciate the additional lighting you arranged, she told Thomas after one meeting. Production in that department has increased 15%. Happy workers are productive workers, Thomas replied. Your father understood that principle long before I arrived. As spring arrived, bringing longer days and warmer weather, the changes at Whitmore Mills attracted attention throughout New England. Other mill owners sent representatives to observe the Workers' Council system, and several implemented similar programs at their own facilities. Samuel Whitmore received an invitation to address the New England Mill Owners Association about his innovative labor management practices. The same organization that had criticized Thomas's promotion now sought to learn from Whitmore's success. On a warm May evening, as Thomas completed his final inspection of the day shift, he encountered Elizabeth Whitmore in the mill courtyard. She was sketching the river view, her artistic talents evident in the delicate lines and careful shading. You've changed everything here, she observed without looking up from her drawing. Father says productivity has never been higher, and worker complaints have virtually disappeared. Change was inevitable, Thomas replied. I simply tried to guide it in a positive direction. Modest as always, Elizabeth smiled. But Father credits you with preventing what could have been a disastrous confrontation. He says your leadership saved not just jobs, but the entire mill's reputation. That evening, Samuel Whitmore summoned Thomas to his office for a private conversation. The mill owner's manner was more relaxed than Thomas had ever seen, his usual formal bearing replaced by something approaching warmth. Thomas, I have a proposition for you, Whitmore began. The new mill wing opens next month, and I need a general manager for the entire operation. The position includes a partnership share in company profits and a house on Elm Street suitable for a family man. Thomas was stunned. Sir, I am deeply honored, but such advancement might create new resentments among— The workers respect you now, Whitmore interrupted. More importantly, they trust you to represent their interests fairly. You've proven that leadership serves everyone best when it serves principle first. I accept, sir, with gratitude. As Thomas walked home that evening, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him from the spinning floor to mill management. The fire that had destroyed the Whitmore mansion had also consumed the rigid barriers that once seemed insurmountable. He thought of his mother in County Cork, who would receive news of his promotion with prayers of thanksgiving. He thought of the workers who had initially viewed him with suspicion, but now sought his counsel on matters both professional and personal. Most of all, he thought of the moment in the burning mansion when he had chosen to act rather than watch, never imagining that split-second decision would reshape his entire life. The Industrial Revolution was transforming America, creating new opportunities for those brave enough to seize them. Thomas Murphy had proven that in this land of possibility, character mattered more than birthplace, courage more than connections, and principle more than politics. As he climbed the hill toward his new home, Thomas smiled at the thought that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that merit, fairly rewarded, could build bridges across any divide. The poor factory worker who had saved 2 hairless sisters had become something he never dared dream, an American success story, earned through fire, tested by adversity, and validated by the trust of those he served.